works out.
Great.
Right. Let's see. We are getting set up on the live now. It should be going in just a minute.
I tell you, I'm always jealous of anyone who has better access to breakfast tacos than I do.
What's so maddening, Marvin, is they're not complicated. It wouldn't take much for someplace here to just, or there. I mean, like,
It's not complicated, but there's just something special about a drive-through breakfast taco that just warms my heart.
Well, you'll just have to come on back and
I've got
come
family
visit.
there, so we in non-pandemic years we get there once or twice a year. So
yeah.
All right. We are live, I think, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Hello, Facebook. Thank you to everybody who's watching and welcome to Ideas on Tap. My name is Caroline Gillespie and I am Program Officer at the Mississippi Humanities Council. Thank you for joining us for the last Ideas on Tap of 2020. It has been quite a year, and I think that we can all agree that we're probably pretty ready for 2020 to end, but we're excited to be closing it out with such an important conversation and a fantastic panel of experts who are all joining us from their offices, their bedrooms, their living rooms. So thank you for joining us. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Ideas on Tap, it is our monthly happy hour discussion program that allows people to come together and discuss important issues in a respectful and civil way. So we are excited to see our panel interact tonight and to share their thoughts with us. But I will say as a disclaimer that the opinions expressed tonight are not necessarily those of the MHC. And I will also say that tonight's program is supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation's Democracy and the Informed Citizen Initiative in partnership with the Federation of State Humanities Councils. So we are very grateful for their support. This has been an ongoing project for us, and this is just one program in a long list of programs that we've been able to support with this grant. I will say we're glad that so many of you are going to be joining us over Facebook and hope that you will participate by asking questions in the chat section of the Facebook video. We will pass your questions on to the panelists. So listen up towards the end of the program to hear your questions addressed and to see what our panelists have to say about them. And if you don't already, be sure to like us on Facebook and to visit our website to learn more about us and the work that we do. And you can also sign up for our e-newsletter there if you're not already on the list. So I will go ahead and hand it over to MHC Executive Director, Dr. Stuart Rockoff, who is going to be moderating tonight's program. So I will let him take it away. Thank you again for participating, and we will see you back with more Ideas on Tap in 2021.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and thanks for doing that disclaimer. So I had it on my list of things to do. After the election, we thought about how could we address some of the issues that came out of the election without necessarily covering the kind of nitty-gritty of the election. And so we thought kind of taking a step back and thinking about what the election says about polarization, about how divided we are as a country. And so as we thought about that, we sort of kind of put together, I think, a really excellent panel that I'm very excited to speak with, and I will introduce them. To start, we have Dr. Marvin King, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Mississippi. He is an author of numerous articles about American politics, democracy, and in particular, African-American political power. Thank you, so Marvin, for being with us. Also, we have Dr. Talia Stroud. Talia Stroud, who is the professor in the Department of Communication Studies in the School of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, Hook'em Horns. She's also the founding director of the Center for Media Engagement at UT. She's the author of Niche News, The Politics of News Choice, and numerous essays and articles about media and democracy. And so we really wanted to bring in that media angle. And so we reached out to our friends at Mississippi Today, and we're very excited to have Kaylee Skinner with us. Kaylee is the managing editor of Mississippi Today, a nonprofit online news organization. Kaylee started at Mississippi Today, I think almost 4 years ago, education reporter. And prior to coming to Mississippi Today, Kaylee worked as a reporter for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, Chalk Beat, and the Hechinger Report. Sorry about that. So thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And to start, I think the best way to start is to ask our political scientist to help explain coming out of the presidential election last month, what does it tell you about the polarization of the American electorate? Mark.
Well, thanks, Stuart. Glad to be here, and thanks to Mississippi Humanities Council for hosting this event. I'm always happy to reach out to a wider audience and talk about these issues. So when we think about party polarization, partisanship, polarization, any of that, it certainly has been getting deeper and more entrenched over the last several election cycles. So the fact that we're experiencing it now is not new or unique. What seems to be different, though, is how, or I should say, what's becoming further pronounced is how entrenched it's becoming. So in a year where you had massive economic dislocation, where you had a pandemic, by the time the election had occurred, almost 250,000 Americans had died from COVID. Yet, it really didn't seem to make too much of a difference in persuading people to change their vote from one candidate or party to the other. So in other words, the deep-seated polarization is so entrenched that it seems immovable. So to many observers, it's as if we have two Americas, right? You've got a red America and a blue America. Obama's famous speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, where he talked about a purple America, unfortunately we seem to be moving away from that. And so this election in 2020 just seemed to manifest itself in the way President Trump, and the way he campaigned, he really seemed to double down on his base. And it didn't appear as if he did a lot of outreach to groups that didn't support him in the past. And so, coming out of 2016, when he won the Electoral College vote, but lost the popular vote by about 3 million, you may have thought, okay, he's going to use the next 4 years to try to reach out to groups of voters that didn't support him to try to bring them over to his coalition. Instead, for the most part, it seems the last 4 years, and this year in particular, he really doubled down on his core supporters, and in a way that worked, in the sense that his base constituencies came out for him like never before. He actually improved on his absolute vote totals from 2016 to 2020, but functionally it was more of the same types of voters. And leaving Biden to really focus on core Democratic areas, which he did very well in, and essentially this was about turnout, and it was less about persuasion, less about getting voters to kind of go back and forth. And so that sort of polarization is really it can be troubling, right? Because if neither side is willing to, if it's difficult for either side to go persuade voters, then it's like, how are we going to get out of this cycle? So all of that by a long introduction.
No, it's good. It's good. And so here's so I like your point about how the base first strategy, which was certainly true with the president, further entrenches this polarization. I mean, so it's kind of a chicken and the egg. So does that, what caused what? So was it him responding to the reality, or was that strategy further causing the problem? If that makes sense?
Well, I'll say this all predates Trump. Trump is a manifestation. Trump is a system of the polarization. Trump did not create polarization. Trump did not even, this is just a trend that's been happening. We can debate about when this started. There's no doubt, there's a lot of data showing that this trend of polarization has been going on for a long time. I tend to chalk it up, it predated 1994, but I really put 1994 as, if you want one singular election that you can say, gosh, things have really been going on this path ever since when. I think 94 is kind of as good of an election as any. And I know our other panelists will be able to talk about this more than I can, but a lot of it is the media environment. Yeah. And part of, so you can ask yourself, the cause of polarization. Well, Americans, there was a wonderful book came out many years ago called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. How Americans tend to move and live, or they sort themselves around, quote, people like us, whoever you are. And then in that, the media environment kind of compounds it. And so if you have people who live in homogenous communities where you're all getting your news from the same sources, and it's different sources than other groups of Americans, we can view the same event through completely different lenses.
Yeah.
And so all of this has just been slowly building up from, to me, 1994. So by the time you get to 2016, we've created the situation by which a President Trump can get elected and not really try to appeal to groups of voters that he did not win in 2016.
Yeah. And so that brings me, I think, I want to bring Talia into this conversation because what you've written about is that polarization is not just about political differences, but that there's something deeper going on. And you call it, I think, affective polarization. So talk about how you sort of define that and what you mean by it.
Yeah, let me just echo just a tremendous thanks to you, Stuart and Caroline and the Mississippi Humanities Council. Such a pleasure to be here and what a wonderful time to have this conversation. I think it's really important. Yeah. So when we think about polarization, there are different ways to think about it, right? There's one way where we think about polarization in terms of people's issue stances being quite different. So you have Democrats and Republicans holding very different beliefs about issues of the day and prioritizing them differently. Right. And in many ways, we could argue that that is perhaps a normatively good thing, that we have a country of people with really different clashing ideas, because that's what can produce progress. It can help people sort through the logic behind things. There's another type of polarization, though, called affective polarization. And this is the idea that people feel emotionally predisposed to their own beliefs and really will just reject the other side without even hearing it. And it's the idea that you start to feel very favorable toward your in-group. And if you look over time, the American public, both Democrats and Republicans, have become less favorable toward those who hold a political view unlike their own. And this affective, emotional, at its extreme form, rather intolerant position to those who don't agree with you, I think we can debate whether that's troubling. And I would side on the position that that actually is a little bit of a tricky thing that the American public is facing. If you aren't even willing to give another person who doesn't share your view the benefit of the doubt or hear potentially what they have to say, that's tricky. And that's really what affective polarization is about.
And so what do you think helped bring us to that state? I mean, so Marvin, 1994, which kind of caused a few things in my brain to kind of click off, but sort of what are you thinking in terms of how we've gotten so far into this?
I mean, there are so many causes, and I am obviously a media scholar, so forgive my own bias. I fully admit it here at the outset. But I think that if we look over the past number of decades and the media environment, we have seen dramatic changes. In the 1980s, we start to see more partisan programming on radio with, for example, a Rush Limbaugh show. We start to see then cable news programming like MSNBC and Fox News come out more prominently and attract large audiences. We see the entrance of the internet that then has sites that are far more extreme than any of those that I've mentioned to this point. And when people are in a media environment that allows them, indeed forces them to choose because there are so many choices, people tend to gravitate toward things that match their beliefs. And there's a little bit of a cyclical thing that happens here, right? The economic model favors getting more audiences, and really extreme rhetoric that reinforces your point of view gets those audiences, and then it polarizes you even further. So it can create these sorts of spirals that I think are particularly worrisome. So I am concerned with the media environment, and I think it goes beyond. We can even look at social media, for instance. Who are you friends with and connected to on social media? What sort of partisan memes do you see when you look through Facebook? For those of you who are watching on Facebook right now, I think it's easy to see how some of this content gets lots of likes and shares, and the algorithm then elevates it in your feed, and then that just creates this cycle again. And so I'm concerned, if I step back and think of the media ecosystem, that we've created a system that rewards inflammatory content that amplifies partisanship and polarization.
Yeah. Well, we're going to come back to that, but I want to bring Kaylee into the conversation. She's, works at a media organization and deals with this, I'm sure. So Kaylee, talk about how you at Mississippi Today deal with this issue of polarization. I know that the original mission of the organization was to provide sort of nonpartisan, straight, fact-based news. And I know y'all get attacked from all angles and both sides. So how do you see your role in this, and how is Mississippi Today trying to navigate this type of media environment that's so polarized?
Well, again, thank you for having me. I'm really
Yeah.
glad to be on this panel with everyone. So I think back to when Mississippi Today launched in 2016. If you guys weren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit. And like you said, part of our label was a nonpartisan news organization. And of course, 2016 is the year when we had another presidential election where the term fake news was coined by President Trump, or then he was not president yet. But so here we are, a news organization launching to cover government and hold public officials accountable. And we so happen to operate in a state where all of our elected officials statewide are Republican. And so we did, you're right, sir, we did get a lot of people saying, you know, you guys are fake news, you guys are attacking Republicans, because if your goal is to hold public officials accountable, then not every story you write is going to be a shining piece on that.
Right.
And so we did see people use social media to say that. And of course, just to what Talia said, if you're on Facebook and someone that you're friends with who shares the same views as you, shares an article that we wrote that said, like, look at this organization, they're just attacking Republicans, then you would probably read that and be like, wow, that's so true. I can't believe they did that. And it's led us to a lot of soul searching, and how do we get people to interact with our content, because that's really we're not here to say what the Republican's doing is right or what the Democrat is doing is wrong. We really just want people to read our information. And so, especially now when we're at a point where it seems almost like the publication of a fact in and of itself is something to debate, like whether that's even true. And so we've been experimenting with, of course, we're writing news stories, and whenever you write a news story, people are going to have opinions and think that you have an angle. But like, we had an election that just happened, and one of our most read stories was just a post on our site of what the ballot looked like. And I think that was because people wanted something where they could see, what is this information? I don't really need to hear from either side on like what they think about this issue. I just want to know what's on the ballot. So it's led us to a lot of thoughts about like, how do we present information without even intentionally or unintentionally giving people the impression that we have an agenda?
Yeah, and it's certainly a challenge because, I mean, the local news environment, especially newspapers, are really struggling. And, you know, there is a real cost to a community, to a state, to a city when you don't have people covering that kind of local news. I mean, so how do you, I mean, so do you let the sort of audience get in your head, you know, and think how this is going to land? I mean, not necessarily on the politics coverage, but on the, I mean, y'all do really important issue coverage, you know, all right, you know, certainly in the Delta and around Jackson. I mean, do you ever worry about that in terms of when you assign articles or how it's going to land? And, you know,
it's been a lot of thought about how we even write stories, whether they're about politics or not, because so much, I think, of media and how you interact with it is about trust and what you think of that organization before you even read. Even if everything in there is factually correct, if you don't like them, then if someone is super liberal and they read Fox News and Fox News's articles is correct, you still might go into it and have an opinion. And so we've thought a lot, not just with our political stuff, like you said, but like when we are writing an article about a community in Schlater in the Delta that doesn't have water,
right?
Are we taking steps to make sure that we're actually speaking to people that live there? Like, are we writing for these people and not about them? Because we can be guilty of that, to just go to the spokesperson or the politician who's saying something, and then if you read an article that you don't see people that looks like you, or clearly the reporter didn't go visit your town or actually do the due diligence, why would you bother to interact with that? So we are thinking a lot about how to gain trust, which is not earned. I mean, I think that's something else we're working on, is we may have good intentions, but we're realizing that we have to make people understand who we are before we can even get to that point.
Yeah. Someone earlier, I think maybe it was Talia, brought up the idea of kind of shared knowledge. And, you know, one of the things about the media, it seems to me, siloization of it, and especially I think we're seeing it now with the election results and the claims of fraud and all that, is it depends on what media source you are watching as to what you believe.
Mm-hmm.
talk about the challenges that creates. I mean, this is open to anybody, to our country, you know, and our government. I mean, is any, I don't know, Marvin, what do you think? I mean, you know,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking, when I was a kid, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and there were two dailies at the time: the San Antonio Light and the San Antonio Express News, and then the San Antonio Light closed. And so once upon a time, it was possible to get lots of information from different sources locally. And as that has kind of faded away, and you know, and then people turn to either talk radio or cable news. And so, and let me backtrack just a bit. One of the reasons I mentioned 1994 is one of the things Newt Gingrich did that was so helpful to Republicans is he got Republican candidates running for Congress to kind of nationalize the issue. So instead of running on this local issue in Georgia or this local issue in Idaho, they all ran on the contract with America, if anybody in the audience remembers that. And so they nationalized it. But what that also meant is it nationalized the talking points, and it nationalized the media environment. So if you were listening to conservative radio or conservative talk, it was those same talking points over and over again, no matter where you were getting the media. And that coincide, well, you know, that kind of predated the law. Well, my media scholars can tell us when local newspapers started, you know, really fading away. But I think there's something to it there where we all, if you are following particular partisan news, you're getting the same information regardless of where you are. And so anyone at the local level who writes anything that is contradictory of that, then someone is telling a lie. And then, so that breeds, I want to, you know, the word I think Kaylee used earlier, you know, trust. And so then people lost trust in their sources. And of course, this is just compounded when elected officials themselves say, hey, this might be a winning strategy. I can beat the media up. They're a straw man I can knock over and over and over again. And so then that kind of creates the cycle where a campaign tactic now is not actual policies. I dare any of our audience to tell me about campaign ads they saw that had to do with actual policies. It was more about an environment, values, a cultural system, but not the actual policies. So I think all of this kind of feeds into itself. And then the last thing I'll say is unrelated to the media is when you tie this environment onto things like gerrymandered seats, where congressional districts are drawn, not all of them, of course, but many of them are drawn specifically not to be competitive, then that makes the primaries more important. And by definition, you're going to get less moderation in those sorts of primaries. But then that just then that media environment then is just going to feed in a more extreme direction towards polarization. So I think it all connects.
Yeah, no, there's some deep structural issues here. There's been some talk in the chat or questions in the chat about the fairness doctrine and the FCC. And so Talia, I wonder if you can maybe give us a quick background on that and how our current environment is quite different than how it used to be.
Right. So the fairness doctrine was the idea that media was obligated to give both sides similar amounts of time. And as that fell off of the agenda, we did start to see the emergence of talk radio programs like a Rush Limbaugh, because it cleared the way for the public airways to not have to honor this requirement of fairness. And I think that the media system we see today is an outcropping in part of that change in regulation. It's unlikely, I think, to come back today because the principle behind it is that we have a shared resource here and not everyone has access to it. And so it was a way to give access. And it's very hard to make that argument in today's world where we have things like a Facebook Live chat right now with people across the country. The access component of it that was part of that back in the day is no longer, it's no longer an issue. And so I think that that really is something that we won't ever see come back. I think that's just not the same principles that governed it don't exist today.
Right, because anybody can kind of get on the internet and express their views. I mean, there's just so many more sort of channels. But one idea that came up also in the chat, which I think relates to it, is the idea of the common good, right? I mean, that the old media environment, although it was limited in terms of the number of channels, there was a sense that these institutions, these sort of media companies or newspapers had a kind of, a larger goal to serve the common good. I mean, is that something that's still sort of relevant for our news media? And it's something that we should be thinking about?
I mean, I think absolutely it is, right? There are media organizations out there that are trying very hard to give people information and to provide it to the best of their ability. So I think that it's easy to get wrapped up in this Fox News, MSNBC, or some of these really fringe sites that are sharing things. But there are really hardworking newsrooms and journalists out there that are trying very hard to do this work. And are they going to get it right all the time? No, they're not. That's why we have this back and forth with audiences. And that's why that's a really valuable loop between a feedback loop between audiences and news organizations. So I think that there's very much still something there, but I think that if we look at the trajectory over time, and Marvin, I think you mentioned this a little bit, it's a tough time to be a local media source. And the economic system behind it has really collapsed over the past decade or so, and the signs are not good right now. So I think that there's some energy there for new startups that have new ideas, and I see lots of potential there, but it's a tricky environment right now.
Yeah. So thinking about the sort of ramifications of our polarization, and I've been thinking about, thinking back to like World War II, sort of when the country pulled together and took part in this, sort of incredible international effort, sort of, and the mobilization. I think there's a great sense of pride that came to our country after that. Do any of y'all worry that this polarization, that it kind of hamstrings our ability to respond to those types of challenges, tackling difficult issues? I mean, what are the ramifications of this polarization?
I would think polarization obviously means there is a divide. And I think a problem we're seeing is people, it's almost now impossible to disagree with someone and not have a conversation. I mean, now it's like, I think this, you think that, we just are never going to talk about it. I don't.
Right, there's no point even talking about it.
And to go back to what Talia was saying, I think this notion of common good and bipartisanship is kind of something we're reckoning with in media today, and that what was for the quote unquote common good in the past often was not actually for the best of a lot of people. I mean, in Mississippi specifically, there were a lot of newspapers that ran things that were harmful to the African American community. And at the time, that was, no one
That's a great point.
thought twice about it. And so now we're starting to see newspapers or news organizations, I should say, think twice about do we need to do this whole both sides thing? Because is one side racist? And is us then correcting that side or running that side with a correction that says this is racist? People then think, oh, well, look at this news media. They have an opinion and they're running a disclaimer when this person's just saying their piece. I mean, we saw it with the flag this year. There are two sides of people that either wanted it down for various reasons or saw it as heritage. But for people who thought we would run a news article that says, here's what people who think it's heritage say, and here's what people who think it's hurtful say, depending on what side you are on, you would think that news article is biased. And it's kind of like why are you giving that side a space to talk?
Yeah. No. Actually, your point about kind of newspapers in the state are very well taken. In fact, Jackson newspapers were notorious for being explicitly racist and frankly not even covering kind of the civil rights movement. So sort of making decisions about what was and wasn't news that were intensely rooted in, sort of in those biases.
Stuart, if I could just add to that point, when, if you go back to the say pre-civil rights movement, if local media decided not to cover, for instance, the civil rights movement and to minimize it, the effects of that are actually felt for generations. Because as a professor here at the University of Mississippi, I've taught a generation of students now who come up to the university and they have no idea about their state's civil rights history because it was minimized. And so if it was minimized, it doesn't get into the textbooks, it's not taught because it wasn't considered important. So these seemingly short-term decisions then have long-term consequences on people's ability to understand, how their state is, got to the place where it is. And you asked about the effects of this polarization, and the coronavirus is a great example of this.
Right.
You look at people's response to a nonpartisan issue like a public health crisis, and it has become polarized. It has become partisan, not because the virus cares if you're a Republican or Democrat, but apparently Republicans and Democrats have different reactions to the coronavirus. And so this is all part of this partisan bubble that we're in.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. An example is kind of the response to the public health. And as we see, it's politicized in this state, Kaylee, right? I mean, how the governor responds and to respond, the criticism. I mean, how have you navigated dealing with the response to COVID with this polarization?
Well, it's kind of a perfect example of what I was talking about when I say that, we are trying to hold elected officials accountable, and we happen to have a Republican governor who is putting forth mandates saying you have to wear a mask and do X and Y. And we are writing stories about how he is not doing that, and he is having Christmas parties. And a lot of people could argue that like we are picking a side or picking on him. And it's also just, it's the news, but we as a news organization can't have a back and forth with every single person that has an opinion. So I don't know, again, we're just trying to put out the information out there and try and make sure that it is, when you read a story, just facts, and let you do with that what you will. But it has been hard. Even a story about the vaccine and the plan for it is now getting a response from some people saying that like we're pushing an agenda.
Wow. So we've spent about 30 minutes focusing on all the problems. So let's spend a little bit of time thinking about how we can possibly get to a solution. I think it's clear that these problems are deeply rooted, they're structural, and there's no simple solution. But Talia, I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you think are some of the things that can begin to move us away from this effective polarization.
Yeah, it's a tricky state, and it's certainly not an easy fix. But we've been doing some work at the Center for Media Engagement, introducing a concept that we're calling connective democracy, which is how do we help to build bridges among citizens, between citizens and institutions, and we see the media as a critical point in doing that. Mm-hmm. And one concept there that I think is an interesting one is there's been a theory for a number of years called intergroup contact theory. And this is basically the idea that if you have interactions with people from a group unlike your own that are positive, that can actually help to break down some of these barriers that we might see. And there are a number of ways that can happen, and some of them are driven by the media, but they can be driven interpersonally as well. So I think of there was a series that an NPR station out of the Pacific Northwest, I think it was KUOW, did called the Ask A series. And they brought together people who were, for instance, they had one night where it was Trump supporters, and it was almost a speed dating sort of scenario where you got to sit down with someone who was a Trump supporter and just ask them questions. And it was meant to be a little bit fun. It was meant to be a way that you're in an environment that allows you to ask questions that you probably couldn't do at any other facet of your life. And I think the inventiveness that we see in people thinking about how do we create contexts that allow people to have conversations across lines of difference when their communities, the book by Bill Bishop, The Big Sort, is a great one, when their communities are homogeneous, when their media diet might be homogeneous, when social media algorithms might promote things to them that keep them in a bubble. Of course, these points are all debated, so I don't want to make it sound like those are set in stone. But I think that these inventive moments of allowing people to talk across lines of difference are just a tremendous way forward.
Yeah, no. And that's certainly that was the original idea behind the Ideas on Tap model. And when we do it in person, I've been and seen conversations between folks who have very, very different politics actually talking to each other. And I have a certain political sort of point of view, and the relationships I have with folks on the other side, they're always in kind of my, I try to see the world through their eyes. So, just being friends with someone who has a very different political view, I found personally sort of has been helpful. But I mean, are there sort of institutions in our society? So like media is sort of one thing that you mentioned, Talia, about they can sort of play sort of an important role. Are there other sorts of institutions? I mean, folks talk about we don't live in the same places, but it's interesting, and I think this is true. There are more Trump voters in California than in any other state in the union, right? A very, very liberal state, millions of Trump voters. So how do we, so I think social media, we're very divided, but in terms of our day-to-day interactions, I mean, what are ways that we can better bridge some of these divides?
That's, I'll start with this. I always love telling my students that Nixon and Reagan come from California and the progressive LBJ came from Texas, and it just kind of blows their mind, because they just don't associate some of those leaders with those states. And it's like, you just have to give, you have to recognize that in a big country like the United States, there's every group in every state. In political science, one of the things that we like to talk about is repeated interactions. When you have repeated interactions with people, generally, game theory says you're going to cooperate and you're less likely to defect and have a bad interaction with them. And so repeated interactions tend to make a difference. But that becomes problematic when we live in our homogeneous, siloed bubbles. And so this is why, public schools and, big urban areas, suburban areas tend to, can be very effective because it brings people together. They have to learn to get along. But if we intentionally then silo ourselves in our neighborhoods, in our churches, then we don't get that repeated interaction with different people. And to use Talia's term from earlier, you get in-group think and out-group think. And people identify with their in-group, and whoever's in the out-group is the opposition. And so part of the way is figuring out how can people in their daily lives, have repeated interactions with folks who may not be just like them, but we can then learn from each other. Easier said than done, of course.
Yeah. So I'm starting to get some questions. And so folks, if folks in the audience do have a question, please type it into the Facebook chat and we'll try to bring it forward. And I think this is really important. I mean, we try to be neutral and unbiased, but someone has asked about asymmetric polarization. So I think a lot of the way we frame this has been sort of neutral, that, both sides are polarized. So how would y'all on the panel respond to that question? Is both sides really to blame, or is there an asymmetry to what we're saying?
I can take that, but I don't want to. Okay.
Well, sorry. We can,
I'll just say that there's a wonderful site called VoteView, and they basically tabulate every vote in Congress since the beginning of time, map it, chart it, and pretty conclusively, that's how we're able to demonstrate that there is this polarization. Well, we also know that Republicans have become more conservative than Democrats have become liberal. Republicans are becoming more conservative, Democrats are becoming more liberal, but the degree is not the same. Republicans in Congress, at least, are becoming more conservative. So if you want to talk about what's driving that polarization, you can start there. So, I know people might talk about like false equivalencies. Both sides are driving it, but there is more to be said about Republicans and conservatives going more to the right than Democrats are to the left. So then a deeper question is, well, why is that happening? So,
Well, Talia, I was struck earlier by your point about how, people on different sides of an issue divide, pro-life, pro-choice, very heated issue, but that there is something healthy to a democracy for those issues coming together. But instead what we're seeing is sort of cultural. So it's almost like one's allegiance comes before issues. And you saw that with how the Republican Party switched on a lot of its core issues like free trade because of the leadership sort of the president. So, and I'm just going to say this or sort of ask this. I mean, how much of this is having a president who was really committed to driving this cultural polarization? And do you perceive his leaving office will hopefully lead to some sort of natural return to a more political polarization? Not to put you on the spot.
No. I mean, we definitely know that when elite figures they are elites for a reason, and they're opinion leaders, and the way that they act and behave influences what people think is acceptable, and it influences the character of the discourse. And so I think when we have any elite figure that's not following typical norms of decorum, that has an effect. And so I don't think we've definitely seen it over the past 4 years. How much this is going to change, I think, remains to be seen. It's hard to speculate. I think a lot depends on what President Trump does next, and what he likes to do. Is he going to have his own media channel, and how many people are going to be watching it, and what will that effect be? But I think that there are ways that elite figures can also change the tenor of the conversation. They can influence the way in which people are relating to one another. And so I think that there's tremendous opportunity, no matter where you're at in the spectrum of, are you at a national level or a more local level? I think that there's an opportunity for many people to try to influence the way in which things are going, and the way you treat other people, and whether you're charitable to different points of view. So even though an elite figure might have an outsized influence, all of us bear some responsibility for thinking about our day-to-day interactions with others and how we go about it.
Yeah, thanks. So here's a question that came through that I think Kaylee would be great to answer. Opinions can be different, but facts can't. How do we combat this sort of distortion of facts? And think about media and the work that you do versus maybe some of the other online sources that don't adhere to the same standards that y'all do.
I think there is a lot of responsibility on the media or news organizations to be transparent and help people understand. I mean, I think there's a whole other conversation, is this the topic of media literacy. Right. But I also think that all of us as consumers have a responsibility to do our due diligence before we share something. I mean, how many times have you seen an article on Facebook, you liked the headline, like you agreed with what the headline said and you shared it? You don't know what that article's about, you just shared it. Or same thing on Twitter. And it could just be because, like we've talked about, it's from an organization that you particularly like. But that's one thing. I think for us as a news organization, we have to be better about explaining why we make the decisions we make, or even explaining, making it very clear whether something's an opinion article versus a news article, because someone might stumble across something and they might not know the difference. And to them, they'll read this opinion thing and think, oh my gosh, listen to these people, like this isn't news. Right. And I think to go back to the question of how to make people understand that facts are not up for debate, I think that just goes back to us. We all need to just do a better job of listening to each other, even if you are fundamentally opposed to what the other person thinks. I don't know how we've gotten to the point where like the truth itself is now something that's up for debate.
Yeah. So what do y'all think is a healthy media diet? Like I'm an average person, who has a certain perspective, like what news sources, what types, I mean, should I be going out of my way to find different, outside of my beliefs? I mean, so in your mind, speak to that. I mean, what is a healthy way to consume media in our culture today? That's a broad question.
I can. Oh, go ahead, Kaylee, you start.
Yeah, y'all can tag.
I think it's great to try and consume news from a variety of sources, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to watch MSNBC and Fox, but it might be good to just see what other people are saying and not just get it from one source, because that can also put you down this warp of what you believe. I think it's also good to share articles that you agree with other people who maybe don't agree with you and see what they have to say about it. And that can kind of lead to discussions and not become something that's so adversarial. And Talia, I didn't want to like interrupt you. I know you had something to say too.
Would do a huge +1 to everything you just said, Kaylee. Yeah, I think that the big part of this is thinking about it being more objective about where you're getting your own news, right? Like, are you potentially in a bubble? If so, maybe check out something on the other side a little bit. But I think the real key is when you're doing that, it's very easy to say, okay, I'm going to flip to this other channel, or I'm going to go to this other website, or do something like I'm going to go to my, aunt's Facebook feed to see what she's doing. But I think we have to really think so carefully about our orientation when we do that, because we just go there. I think the tendency is to either laugh at it, make fun of it, or to counter argue. And I think we need to just think to ourselves, like, is there a way that I could do that? And just ask myself, like, what are the values underneath this? Because a lot of these issues that are so heated and at this level of cultural conflict, there are actually really good values underneath that, like valuing life. That's a good thing. We all agree with that. Valuing the right to choose. That's a good thing. We all agree with that. And people are prioritizing these things in different ways. But I think if we start to think about, there's some common humanity and values that can help us to understand that, but the orientation has to change. We can't just go to the other side and expect that all of a sudden we're all going to get along.
Yeah, and I think it's also true when you read something, whether you react strongly, like I agree with everything in this, or I hate everything in this, we all need to kind of do some reflection and think about why do I have this reaction to this? Is it because what's in here is incorrect? Like if they're not citing a source, or it seems to have come out of nowhere? Or is it just that I really don't agree with this perspective? And those are two really different things that I think we just conflate with each other.
Yeah. And at the risk of sort of biting the hand that is now feeding us, Facebook, and there is a question that relates to that platform. What about Facebook and other large social media entities? Why should they be held to the same standard as the mainstream press outlets? And how has Facebook and social media changed the way news is produced and consumed? That's kind of a big question. Who wants to try to start tackling it?
I will say that my job is in editorial. I'm not necessarily the social media person, but I can say that for news organizations, Facebook, we've seen over the years, they're the kingmakers almost of what you come across. I mean, there is an algorithm that determines what you're going to, well, I don't know if it still does this, but it was a problem for a long time. And that if you happened to lean to the right, you're probably going to come across articles that supported that, and vice versa. And so a news organization can be putting out all of their stuff on Facebook. It might never make it to you. And so that's been a huge problem with just like awareness for us.
Yeah. Talia, beating those algorithms, I mean, talk about how they've helped accelerate these sort of differences. I mean, my Facebook feed is totally different than someone else's Facebook feed, even if we follow a lot of the same people, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Facebook has a record of everything you click on, how much time you spend, how many times you access per day. And algorithmically, it's determining what additional content to serve you so that you stay on the site longer, so that you click on some of the advertisements. That's the game. And so I think that this has changed the way in which people consume news. There's now a significant, I should say a not insignificant, it's not a majority by any means, but there's a significant chunk of the population that says they get their news from Facebook, and that they're actually not seeking it out themselves. They rely upon their network to give them the news. They call it a news finds me phenomena, where people just assume if it's important enough, it will get to me. And I think that that's actually a really tricky thing, because we're seeding the prioritization that used to be part of a very honored tradition of an editorial a staff member or whole entire staff, right, that are determining what are the issues of the day and how are they prioritized. And there are definitely problems with that. Kaylee mentioned earlier that maybe some of the things that would have been really important to some communities weren't elevated in the way that they should have been. But I think we see a greater recognition that that's happening. And that's ceding all of that to a private company whose interest and whose objective is not to inform the public. That's not what they're here for. They're here to make money. Yeah. And so I think that we have to think more about this. Now, I have been not very kind to social media in saying that. So I'll also say that I think that they do feel pressure. They feel public pressure to think more about these things. We've seen them take down misinformation during the past election or label it. And so they're clearly playing on this field of having some sort of editorial role. They're doing it right now. And I just think it's so important that every American understands what's happening in these spaces, and that we're not electing these people. They're not editorial board members of a news organization that's goal is to inform us. So I think that there are really critical conversations to be had about what's the role of government, what should we demand of these companies? Are they so big that we can't even make a demand as citizens that has any effect at all? So a huge question, and we could probably spend days talking about it. So thank you to whoever posed that.
Yeah. You know, well, if we're still live on Facebook, so maybe that caused them to make a conversation. But there's a good question that, and I kind of want to bring Marvin into this, because there was a question for you, because you mentioned earlier how so many of your students come to the university knowing so little about the civil rights history and the history of their own state. So talk about what you think we can do to sort of address that issue, and connecting it to how do we encourage young people today to not just be aware of the past, but to consume political news and consume it wisely. So Marvin, why don't you start?
Sure. You know, I'm not a a K through 12 educator, but I know what I would like to see is early age students, 5-6-year-olds, start to get introduced to these kind of difficult issues, and it can be done very seamlessly. Kind of like foreign language education should start much earlier than we typically do it here in America. And it should be the same with civil rights education. You can start with just introductions about biographies of important people. Mm-hmm. And like, oh, who was Martin Luther King, and who was, anybody that you can think of from that era, and start it earlier. And then each progressive year, you can add more context to it. And so that way, by the time they are age appropriate, then you take them to the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, right? Mm-hmm. And then you start pulling in, the full picture, so that way the students can put it all into context, and you just do it age appropriate. But if you tend to wait until they're in 9th grade or 10th grade during Black History Month, you cram it all in 3 weeks, then you're only going to be able to teach so much, right? And so, if you do that, then I think it's easier for students on their own to take a more holistic view to the media that they consume, because then they've heard of more. So then they're just going to be more open to receiving more information about more subjects. And it's not, but if the school treats these subjects as taboo, then they're going to think that they're taboo and not really want to learn much about it. So that's kind of how I would start.
And certainly to say
I was just going to say, if I might set Kaylee up here, I know that Mississippi Today has been very creative about their use of theater and partnerships to try to educate on civil rights. And I don't know if you want to add more, Kaylee, but the partnerships that you all have done with CIR and producing plays, or just
with Storyworks and some other organizations to kind of like I said in the beginning about sharing the story about the ballot. That's not news. I mean, it's also, not everyone wants to sit down and read a news story, especially kids may not care to sit down and read about, I don't know, what the governor says about taxes, but that does affect them. So it's on us to figure out ways to disseminate that in a different way, but also make it more interesting. And so that could mean like doing a better job of putting a face on a story, or even just talking to these young people themselves as a news organization to hear what they like. I guess it would also be, what do you guys want to know? So that then that goes back to building trust with us. So there's just a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. And so I'll just plug the Jimenez Council that we helped to fund, I think, the Beautiful Agitators Project.
Yeah.
Which told the story of a very important African-American woman who helped lead the kind of local civil rights movement. And that's the thing, Marvin, about Mississippi, is that those stories are in literally every single town. Every single town has an incredible civil rights story. So it doesn't necessarily, and so it's, the fact that people are growing up in these communities and not knowing people like Vera Mae Piggy and Clarksdale, whatever, there's just a lot of work to do. I had a question, and I'm sure Kaylee has thought about this, and probably Talia too. Do like young people consume news differently? And do y'all think about, I grew up, through the old newspaper. How are young people getting their news, and what does that bode for the future of these issues?
I can say for the people that read us, a lot of people consume their news through their phone. And whereas like in the past, it was actually through a physical newspaper or on your desktop, a lot of people still do use their desktop, but a lot of people use their phones. And so that then leads us to think about like, how does the way our website looks or the way a headline displays look on a phone versus on your desktop? Because you may, like, if you're looking on your phone and it just looks ugly, like you don't want to read that. It has to catch your attention. So yeah, I would say most people, I use my phone to get news, although I'm also a young person, so.
Lucky you. Yeah. And so like Talia, so then do you see kind of young people interacting with news differently than the way that middle-aged people might?
I definitely see it through my students, and Marvin, I imagine you've seen this through your students as well. But since I've been teaching, there is a definite shift in the way in which news gathering happens. And when I first started teaching, you could talk about the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and people would kind of rally around that. And now that is just so old. In fact, my husband's also a professor, and the other day, one of his students asked him who Jon Stewart was. I think we both went, oh gosh. So, it evolves, but now I totally agree. So many people are on their phone. So many people are consuming news via Twitter and via social media outlets, and also really kind of niche publications. Email newsletters like the Skim all of a sudden are coming up in class as a source that people are nominating. Every year I ask my students at the beginning of the year what their main source is for news, and the biggest growth has been social media, and particularly Twitter.
Wow. Yeah. Well, we're coming to a close, and so I'll ask each of you to maybe give a closing thought, and maybe the theme is, what are some simple things, or so maybe one thing that we can do to try to counteract some of this polarization in our daily life? What comes to mind? Who wants to begin?
Political scientists, we're professional cynics. No one comes to us for solutions.
Yeah, but you're optimistic type though, Marvin.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll go with that. Thank you. So I think it has to do with, people's, the only nice way to say this is, are people satisfied with the status quo? And how low do we have to sink in public discourse before enough people say that we can do better, right? So, and I hate saying that we've got to, and hopefully maybe we've reached a low point and we'll start to build back up, but I'm not sure we're there yet. But I think we might have to hit rock bottom and then kind of build up in a way that people are willing to, to use the cliche, cross the aisle, and talk with others and break bread with others. But I feel like we might have to reach some sort of inflection point where people say, no, we've sunk too low. And I wish there was a more simpler, positive,
Yeah.
So hopefully someone's got a better answer.
Thanks. Anyone else? Thoughts?
I would say just double down on what I've been saying during our whole meeting, in that try and be responsible about the news you consume. And if you read something that gives you pause or you have a question, realize that there are human beings behind the news you produce, and we are here to talk to you. So if you have a question, usually our emails or our phone numbers are listed there, and we are real people that will respond. We want to be having this discourse with you too. So also just read the news, because that also helps a lot in terms of how informed people are. And I'm going to plug MississippiToday.org. But yeah, we're here and we want to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Talia, any closing thoughts about how we can work against this polarization?
Yeah, I think in closing, I think having each person just really be a critic of the way in which you're consuming and interacting with others. There's this phenomena, and they call it the hostile media bias, where if you have an article that does cut down the middle as best as we can ascertain, people on both sides believe that it's biased against them, which means that for these sources of information that are really trying hard, their best day is everyone's mad at them. And I often think about that, especially as I teach aspiring journalists, that, wow, that's a hard place to be. And it turns out that if you're just a little bit slanted, you actually can get some people to say like, oh, good job, you're unbiased. So I think the more that we check ourselves and think about that and know that this affects all of us, it affects me, it affects everyone, I think that we're actually much better off. And then we can cut some slack to those journalists that are trying so hard to make this, to share information in ways that they don't always get right. And sometimes it probably does have a bias, but I think checking ourselves can help us to support those institutions that are just so critical to our democratic enterprise.
Mm. Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you for this great conversation. I think it's been, for me, very eye-opening and instructive, and it's helped me look at, I mean, because I'm just like anyone else, I'll sit on my phone and go through Twitter and get all agitated and amped up, but kind of stepping back and really thinking about, how the behavior and things that I am doing help foster this greater polarization. And what can we do as a council, as a society, as a neighbor, to try to begin to build those sorts of bridges. So I want to thank Marvin King, Talia Stroud, and Kaylee Skinner for being with us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation into the future. And thanks to everyone watching on Facebook Live, and stay tuned for more exciting events coming from the Humanities Council.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.